The Great Depression wasn't just a backdrop for Bonnie and Clyde. It was the very fuel for their fire. Imagine a world where banks were failing, farms were turning to dust, and millions were out of work. People were desperate, angry, and felt betrayed by the system. In this bleak landscape, Bonnie and Clyde emerged not just as criminals, but as symbols of rebellion. They weren't robbing the rich to give to the poor, not exactly, but they were hitting the banks and institutions that many ordinary people blamed for their misery. Their story spread like wildfire, passed through hushed conversations and sensational newspaper headlines. For some, they were Robin Hood figures, sticking it to the man. This public sympathy was their invisible shield. It allowed them to move through the countryside, finding unlocked doors and willing helpers among those who saw them as kindred spirits, fellow victims of a broken system. The dust and desperation of the era created the legend, transforming two small-time crooks into folk heroes. Their life on the run was a relentless series of close calls, punctuated by moments of pure chaos. In the summer of 1933, near Wellington, Texas, their luck took a dark turn. Clyde, known for his reckless driving, was speeding down a country road at night. He missed a detour sign for a bridge that was under construction. The Ford V8 plunged into a dry ravine. The crash was violent. Clyde and W.D. Jones were thrown clear, but Bonnie was trapped. The car's battery acid spilled, severely burning her right leg from the hip down to the foot. The acid ate through her flesh, right down to the bone in some places. She was in excruciating pain, and for a while, it seemed she wouldn't survive. Clyde and Jones managed to pull her from the wreckage and flag down a nearby farmer, who took them into his home. The farmer's family, seeing Bonnie's horrific injuries, had no idea who their guests were. They just saw people in desperate need of help. This accident would change everything. Bonnie would never walk properly again, and her constant, debilitating pain would cast a long, dark shadow over their remaining days. After the accident, Bonnie was crippled. Her leg was a roadmap of agony, the burns so severe that she often had to be carried. This is where a different side of Clyde Barrow emerged. The cold-blooded killer, the man who wouldn't hesitate to shoot his way out of a trap, became a devoted nurse. He refused to leave her side, even when it put the entire gang at greater risk. He carried her from cars to their hideouts, his small frame straining under her weight. He tended to her burns as best he could, using whatever makeshift supplies they could steal or buy. Imagine the scene, hiding out in a stuffy tourist cabin, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear, Clyde gently changing Bonnie's dressings. This dependency forged an even deeper, more desperate bond between them. She relied on him for her very survival, and he, in turn, seemed to draw a strange strength from his role as her protector. It was a testament to their twisted, all-consuming love story. His devotion was absolute, a stark contrast to the brutality he showed the world. He was her anchor in a sea of pain, and she was his reason to keep running. To survive, the Barrow gang needed to disappear. They became phantoms of the back roads, melting into the rural fabric of the Midwest. Their hideouts weren't lavish safe houses. They were cheap tourist cabins, abandoned farmhouses, or sometimes just a secluded spot in the woods where they could park their stolen car. They paid for everything in cash, often using money from their latest robbery. They relied heavily on the unwritten code of the countryside. In an era of deep mistrust for the government and law enforcement, many rural folks were willing to turn a blind eye. Some were sympathetic, seeing the gang as rebels against a failed system. Others were simply intimidated. A farmer might sell them groceries and gasoline without asking questions. Not because he supported their crimes, but because he feared what would happen if he said no. This network of quiet, often unwilling, sympathizers was crucial. It allowed them to rest, to heal, to plan their next move. They would stay in one place for a few days, maybe a week, always on edge, before the paranoia set in and it was time to move on, leaving behind little more than empty food cans and a lingering sense of unease. The beginning of the end started with a party in Joplin, Missouri. The gang rented an apartment over a garage. They were loud, they drank, and their rowdy behavior drew the attention of neighbors who called the police. When lawmen arrived for what they thought was a routine check on some bootleggers, all hell broke loose. The gang opened fire, killing 2 officers in a brutal, one-sided gunfight before escaping. But in their hasty retreat, they left everything behind. The police found a treasure trove of evidence, including a camera with undeveloped film. Those pictures, once published, were a sensation. They showed Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth, mockingly holding a shotgun on Clyde. They were goofy, intimate, and humanizing. But for law enforcement, they were a goldmine. The photos put faces to the names, turning the gang from shadowy figures into identifiable targets. The public, once sympathetic, began to see them as bloodthirsty killers. The Joplin shootout marked a turning point. It stripped away their anonymity and ignited a firestorm of law enforcement efforts to bring them down. From that day forward, the noose began to tighten. Their folk hero status was dissolving, replaced by the grim reality of a nationwide manhunt. They were no longer just running. They were being hunted. The final chapter was written in a place called Platte City, Missouri. After Joplin, the gang was on high alert, but they were also exhausted and wounded. They checked into the Red Crown Tourist Court, a brick cabin complex that they hoped would offer a bit more security. But their suspicious behavior, like taping newspapers over their cabin windows, quickly tipped off the motel owner. The law was notified. And this time, they came prepared. A heavily armed posse surrounded the cabins in the dead of night. They were armed with Thompson submachine guns and Browning automatic rifles. The ensuing shootout was like a scene from a war movie. Bullets tore through the brick walls of the cabin. Clyde, ever the resourceful leader, managed to get their car started amidst a hailstorm of gunfire. They smashed through the garage door and sped away into the darkness. But not before paying a heavy price. Buck Burrow was shot in the head, a devastating wound, and his wife, Blanche, was blinded by glass shards. They escaped, but they were broken. The gang was shattered. The escape from Platte City was a desperate, bloody retreat. They drove for days, trying to find a safe place to tend to Buck's horrific head wound, but there was nowhere to hide. The law was closing in from all directions. Their flight ended in an abandoned amusement park near Dexter, Iowa. A local posse alerted to their presence, surrounded their campsite. Another furious gunfight erupted. In the chaos, Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones managed to escape on foot, scrambling across an open field under heavy fire. But Buck was too gravely wounded to move, and Blanche refused to leave his side. They were captured. Buck died from his injuries a few days later. This was the final blow to the Barrow gang as a cohesive unit. It was now just Bonnie and Clyde, along with the young W.D. Jones, who would soon leave them. They were alone, wounded, and hunted by every lawman in the country. The romantic image of the rebellious gang was gone, replaced by the grim reality of two desperate outlaws running on borrowed time. The net was closing, and they both knew their story could only have one ending. In the final months, the legend gave way to a grim, painful reality. Bonnie's leg injury left her in constant, agonizing pain. She couldn't walk and had to be carried everywhere by Clyde. They were isolated, paranoid, and utterly alone. Their former allies were either dead, in prison, or too afraid to help. They spent their days driving aimlessly, sleeping in the car, and eating cold sandwiches, always looking over their shoulders. The newspapers that once painted them as romantic figures now called them mad dogs that needed to be put down. The public's fascination had curdled into fear and condemnation. They drove through the familiar back roads of Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. But the landscape that once offered them shelter now felt like a cage. Every stranger's face was a potential threat. Every police siren, a prelude to their doom. This wasn't a glamorous life of rebellion anymore. It was a slow grinding, painful descent into oblivion. A prelude to the inevitable ambush that awaited them on a dusty Louisiana road. The law's pursuit was now personal and relentless, led by a man named Frank Hammer. Hammer was a legendary Texas Ranger, a tough, old-school lawman coaxed out of retirement for one final job: to stop Bonnie and Clyde. He wasn't interested in arresting them. His mission was to eliminate them. Hammer was a methodical hunter. He studied their movements, their habits, and their family connections. He knew they were creatures of habit, often circling back to see their families. He correctly predicted that the Methvin family, whose son Henry was the gang's latest addition, would be the key. Hammer made a deal with Henry's father. In exchange for his son's pardon, the father would help set a trap. The location was a rural highway near Sales, Louisiana, a route Clyde was expected to take to visit the meth. On the morning of May 23, 1934, Hammer and his posse of 5 other officers hid in the bushes along the road. They parked the father's truck on the side of the road as bait, making it look like it had a flat tire. Then, they waited. The morning was quiet and humid. At around 9:15 a.m., the familiar tan Ford V8 came speeding down the road. Clyde was behind the wheel, Bonnie beside him. He saw the familiar truck and slowed down, pulling over to help. It was the moment Hammer had been waiting for. Before Clyde could even react, the posse opened fire. There was no warning, no call to surrender. They unleashed a deafening barrage of over 130 rounds from automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols. The car was shredded, holes punched through the metal and glass. Clyde was killed instantly, his foot slipping off the clutch. The car, still in gear, rolled slowly forward as the bullets continued to pour in. Bonnie, who had been eating a sandwich, screamed just before she was killed. The fusillade was so intense, so brutal, that the undertaker later had trouble embalming the bodies. The ambush was ruthlessly efficient. In a matter of seconds, the reign of Bonnie and Clyde was over, ending not in a blaze of glory, but in a storm of steel on a lonely country road. The dust settled, revealing a scene of shocking violence that would be seared into the American consciousness forever. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, be sure to like and subscribe for more.